All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Big Three on CPA TV. As always, my name is Mihir Torsekar, and I am joined by my co-host and fellow economist at CPA, Andrew Rechenberg. And today we're going to talk to you all about the big three topics happening in trade. But before we get to the main episode, we want to preview what we're going to be talking about today. So first on the agenda is that CPA just recently released our Chips for Chips plan. It's a plan for industrial sovereignty in the semiconductor industry for the United States. So the report highlights a number of items. Number one, we talk about the fact that official trade data tends to underestimate how great our America's chip dependence is on foreign countries. The second thing is that we discuss about what the chip for chip tariff strategy is that we believe is the administration is planning to unveil in the next couple of weeks. And then we talk about the importance of creating demand incentives to further utilize fabrication capacity in the United States. The second item, Andrew, why don't you tell us about what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so for the second topic this week, we have the U.S. beef market. Beef prices have soared over the past year by about 14%, and this has caused a big political issue for not just Trump's base, but really the entire American population. And Trump has blamed this issue largely on America's ranchers, and has even opened up the U.S. to more imports of beef from Argentina to try to bring down prices. But this whole framing is misguided. Ranchers aren't the real problem, and imports aren't going to fix the issue. Imports have already been at record highs over the past few months, and the prices have continued to rise. And so the real issue is America's domestic supply. It's our own ranchers and our own cattle herds, which our own cattle herds are at the lowest level now than they have been since 1951. So it's at basically a record low in the modern era. And to make matters worse, we have the big four meat packers who together control over 80% of the market share. And they've been distorting supply, manipulating country of origin labeling, and really distorting prices for both ranchers and for consumers. And this is shown. They had to recently settle a class action lawsuit alleging price collusion, with one of the big packers colluding with all the other big packers to depress bid prices that are paid to U.S. ranchers, while at the same time jacking up prices at the grocery store and just capturing all the margins for themselves. And so this is the real issue behind the beef prices. It's not about ranchers. It's about this monopoly control in the market and a record low U.S. cattle herd. And so I'll kick it back to me here for the final topic of the week.
Great. Yeah. So today the Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments with tremendous implications for American businesses, consumers, and presidential power in hearing a ruling about the IEEPA tariffs, the emergency or questioning the legality or arguing the legality of President Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs on imports on more than 100 countries. So with that, let's get to the episode. Okay, so the first item on the agenda is the CPA just recently released the Chips for Chips plan and discussed what the implications are for the U.S. semiconductor industry. We believe that this is potentially a blueprint really for industrial sovereignty. And we identified a number of items that were of real value, I think. Number one, we talk about the fact that official trade data underestimates America's true chip dependence. So custom statistics, when an import is recorded, they're really only recording like the finished good that comes over the border. So for example, if you're importing a car, they're just going to show that this is the car that was imported. They're not going to talk about the component parts embedded in that car. So when we talk about semiconductors, we look at, okay, well, this is the volume of semiconductors that are imported. But actually what the semiconductors that we acquire from abroad really come embedded in consumer electronics and automobiles and all kinds of different products. And so when you account for what is actually being imported through those embedded products, we showed in our report that there is the U.S. import dependence actually rises from 69% to about 83%. So that just gives you an idea of how deeply embedded America's semiconductor demand is met through the foreign supply chains rather than from domestic production. And then we talked about the chip for chip strategy. And so we ran our own calculation. We kind of constructed a an equilibrium model for discussing what an estimate of potential revenues could come. We said about $230 billion in tariff revenue over the next 5 years, and we identified that another $153 billion in private sector investments could be made into the semiconductor industry over the next 5 years as a result of that chip for chip strategy. And so just the idea in a nutshell is just that U.S. Companies who want to import semiconductors, if you're able to achieve credits or import credits to import from abroad, but it has to be contingent on you making actual verifiable pledges to make the matching number of investments in the United States to rebuild U.S. capacity. So it's a really simple but kind of powerful premise, I think, that undergirds that strategy. And then the other idea that we talk about in the report is the fact that technology and automotive companies in the U.S. continue to source cheaper alternatives from abroad, and we actually have capacity that is being underutilized in the United States. So by calling attention to that, we identify the need to try to build up demand in the United States and create a demand signal for those fabs to continue to utilize capacity. Andrew, I wanted to talk to you actually about the second item. You just released a report on the beef industry, and why don't you talk us through what your main findings were?
Yeah, so this has been a big political issue for President Trump over the last couple weeks, and he's got into a little bit of a spat with U.S. ranchers on the issue, basically saying things along the lines of prices are too high, ranchers need to lower prices, and really blaming all the high beef prices you see at the grocery store on the ranchers. But this is really forgetting a lot of major aspects that are at play in the beef market, and the price that ranchers set for selling their cattle are by no means what you see at the grocery store. There's a huge middleman problem in the industry, and that's primarily these big meat packers. And they have basically what they operate as a near cartel capacity over the market. They work together, and they've been settling lawsuits alleging price setting among all the big four meat packers, that they basically force the ranchers to accept low bid prices, and they pit them against all these cheap imports that are coming particularly from Mexico or from Argentina, now that Trump has opened up that market. And so they pay all the ranchers a lot less money. Then they capture a huge middleman margin for themselves. And then they jack up the price at the grocery store, because same thing with the grocery store. If you want to buy packaged beef, whether it's in steaks or ground beef, the grocery stores have these big four industries that control the whole market, and that's who you can buy from. And so they have this huge power over the market, and they're really abusing this power. And it's not that the ranchers that are benefiting. The U.S. cattle herd is at its lowest level since 1951. They're not doing as well as they could be. They're not doing well at all due to these imports and these meat packer issues. And so really the whole point of our report was showing what's really going on in the market. It's not that these ranchers are to blame for the issue. And in fact, these additional imports are just going to make the problem even worse over the long term. It's going to drive down the cattle herd even more, really depress any of those margins that the ranchers need, and all the profits are going to go to these middlemen. And it also ignores a lot of the sanitary issues that we're seeing in a lot of these countries. The reason we had restrictions on Argentinian beef in the first place was because they had a lot of disease outbreaks down there, diseases that the U.S. hadn't seen since the 1920s. And we recently saw an issue like that pop up in Mexico with the screwworm disease, where we had to cut off imports from Mexico. So these are cheap beef, but it's not just because they have a strategic advantage in making this beef. They're cutting a lot of corners with sanitary stuff. Diseases are a lot more likely to outbreak. And then when a crisis does occur, we have shortages and higher prices like you see now. And so really just we need to reframe this issue and realize that it's not the ranchers that are to blame. They're the ones who are actually supplying us with the beef. It's, as in a lot of industries, like with pharmaceuticals, it's these middlemen that drive up the margins, and they capture so much of the profits, and they make it hard to make things here in the U.S., and it's a problem we have to solve.
It's really remarkable how many industries this is becoming very apparent that this bargain, I guess, that we made long time ago, that we would just push for the lowest cost in everything, lowest cost food, lowest cost pharmaceuticals, lowest cost semiconductors, etc., across every industry, across the supply chain. And now it's just all just kind of hitting us all at once. It's really remarkable. I mean, because the fact that we've, when we're at the point where we're jeopardizing our health, really, to compromise on that front just to get cheaper alternatives, there's a real consequence there. I mean, is the ranchers issue, the declining herds, I guess, is that largely because of cheap imports that have just kind of overwhelmed our ability to compete?
Yeah,
Is that something
exactly.
that you found, or?
Yeah, imports are a direct cause from it. And another issue that I hadn't mentioned yet that compounds the import problem is the repeal of the country of origin labeling for beef. And Congress repealed this a few years back, and it's been really devastating for US ranchers. Basically, what it allows is it allows you to import live cattle from Mexico, Canada, which is being done in large numbers, at least before the recent ban from Mexico. And the meat packers are able to buy these both live cattle and beef from Mexico, bring it into the US, slaughter it in the US, repackage it in the US, and then they're able to label it as product of the USA, beef, even though that cattle was born, raised, and even possibly slaughtered in Mexico. But just because it was repackaged or slaughtered in the US, that counts as substantial transformation, and it's US beef now. But it's not US beef. And so this has been another thing that has been really harming US ranchers, that even if consumers want to do the right thing, if they want to support US beef, if they want to have good, high quality beef, they don't even know. And the meat packers use this relentlessly to pit imports against domestic producers and say it'll look the same at the grocery store at the end of the day, but you have to accept Mexican prices and Mexican wages and labor for US ranchers, which is just unsustainable. And so the combination of these issues, along with the meat packer power, has been devastating for US ranchers, and something needs to be done, whether it's a combination of tariffs, possibly even antitrust action against the meat packers, or just really having, at the basic level, accurate labeling at the grocery store. That would go a long distance.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's classic case of imperfect information. If you're a consumer and you go to the market and you're, like you say, you're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to buy American, you want to know where your beef is sourced from, and you can't even trust that that's the case. And it's the same thing with the pharmaceutical side of things, where it's like, where, I think if most people knew that most of their medications, generic medications that they're taking, is from India or from China, that would go a long way to kind of building this argument for folks to say, well, you know what, maybe I am willing to pay a little bit more at the register for something I know that has a seal of quality, and is made in my local economy, an economy I can trust, has a reliable supply chain and production process, quality controls that I can rely on. It's just frankly astonishing that isn't something that we have been more vocal of, that our politicians and our leaders have not done something like that. It's really unfortunate. So I think I wanted to pivot to the third item on the agenda. Now this is the Supreme Court today is hearing oral rulings on the IEEPA tariffs, the emergency powers that President Trump has used to issue tariffs on on more than 100 countries. So he's justified, of course, tariffs as necessary to reduce the trade deficit, spur domestic manufacturing, but they've been challenged by dozens of states as well as some small businesses, and they've drawn some skeptical questioning, I think, from some of the liberal and conservative justices. And so I think that's where we are at that stage in the game. I know that we're going to be bringing Chuck Benoit, who's obviously following this case very aggressively. He's our legal counsel and our expert on a lot of these legal trade matters. Wanted to know, I mean, from what you're hearing or what you've seen about the oral argument so far, or what, just in general, what your general thoughts are about the rulings and where we're at and what the implications might be.
Yeah, along with just the general trend of what the lower courts have ruled and what today's oral arguments are looking like, it's not looking particularly good for the legal standing of IEEPA in the Supreme Court. And so I am a little bit skeptical on this end, and it is a bit of a shot for the Trump administration. It's especially a shot for revenue. And so I think that this really makes the case clear for Congress to legislate a revenue tariff, because this has secured a massive amount of revenue for the US government. But I also don't think it's a complete loss, because I think it would be better if the Trump administration focused a little more, particularly on proven legal tariffs that can work and are actually more effective because they go by industry. And what I'm talking about here is Section 232 tariffs. I think if the Trump administration pivots away from its focus on IEEPA tariffs and starts really focusing on sector by sector specific tariffs based on products, based on industry input, and really tailoring these responses based on Section 232, which has had a legal basis for many years now, that's going to be a much more effective approach going forward. And so I hope that that's the one positive outtake from all of this.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I also think even Section 301 as well. I mean, just the advantages of going that route means that, yeah, you lose a little bit of flexibility and agility in that you can't just impose a tariff on the whim. You're required by law to issue or to conduct an investigation of at least 6 months, I believe. And so there is some legal grounding in that. And when I've talked to folks about this who are questioning, okay, look, I want to make an investment in this particular sector or whatever sector it is, but I don't know that these tariffs are going to, how enduring are they going to be from administration to administration? No one wants to put investments into, capital projects or, make any capital spending because there's a lot of money on the line here. You don't want to do that if you think that the next administration is just going to, wipe away those tariffs. But what I like to think about is just in the limited, 10-year period or so, roughly a little less than 10 years. But since the first Trump administration, we've now seen actually when he imposed 232 tariffs on the steel and aluminum sector, which was almost like a trial balloon for this whole process. The Biden administration came in and they didn't remove them. They kept them in place. Now they applied, quotas and they made some certain adjustments, but the program still remained in place. So perhaps there is some, some credibility or some idea or some support for the idea that those policies, whether it's a 301 or 232, would stay on the books. And again, IEEPA feels a lot more maybe flimsy or certainly more subject to legal questioning as we're seeing now. So I think I'm with you. I think that this actually could be potentially a positive development. So we'll just definitely have to see how that goes. Do we have Chuck on, by the way? I mean, is Chuck... Yeah, so Andrew and I have kind of teed up the discussion regarding the SCOTUS oral arguments that they're hearing right now about the IEEPA tariffs and whether they're going to be struck down, what the implications could be. Chuck, I think you'd be the perfect person to talk to us through some of your thoughts and what you are seeing, I guess, out there so far.
Sure. So yeah, I just finished listening. So I'll give a little color commentary from the perspective of kind of a protectionist trade lawyer, not someone who specializes in constitutional doctrines, but works with tariffs day in, day out. So the hearing and the whole case has been simultaneously extremely interesting and exasperating. So there's basically two separate streams of arguments. Now, the two separate streams are, one is kind of like just one, it's just focused on the text of the IEEPA law. So the IEEPA law now infamously does not actually mention tariffs, uses the phrase regulate imports. And so there's just sort of like this like textual question as to whether regulate imports includes the power to assess tariffs. To me, that's super boring. I'm not even interested in it. So it's just like, it's weak, it's boring, and I actually think that, and it's actually figured it's been most prominent in the decisions below the Supreme Court to date. Maybe this is too cynical. I view it as a way of kicking the can. They're like, we don't like this, so we're going to strike it down because the statute doesn't say tariffs. And by doing that, we don't have to get into the more thorny, complicated, nuanced, layered constitutional questions. So, but now, because I did listen to the oral arguments as well at the Court of Appeal. So a big difference with the Supreme Court is they did not hesitate, especially the conservative justices and Justice Kagan, from leaning in on the constitutional question of the non-delegation doctrine, which to me is always the biggest thing. So I appreciate, Gorsuch, Alito, they're saying, look, let's just assume the statute says tariff. Let's just assume you've got it, okay? But can Congress just delegate its Article 1, Section 8 tariff power to the president wholesale? The challengers, all the various challengers, states and Democratic congressmen, their position. They do say no, but they've wanted, because non-delegation doctrine's been like a weaker argument historically. Courts have been reluctant to overturn action on that. They wanted to lead with the textual. And so this is the first time we've really saw the constitutional topics play so prominently in the oral arguments. Look, I see. So I see the conservative justices of Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas not liking IEEPA on because of concerns that it's an unconstitutional delegation. Kavanaugh is a bit more interesting. Well, I shouldn't say more interesting. He seems to have his own take where he's more willing to allow it and not strike it down on non-delegation doctrines because he sees tariffs as more linked to the president's foreign affairs power. So I think Kavanaugh is a bit of a wild card there. I could see him writing explicitly on constitutional grounds to support it. Justice Roberts, he struck me as pretty hostile, in particular in the major powers doctrine, which is, like, look, if Congress wanted to give a major power to the president, it would be clear on that point, which to me is a lot less interesting than non-delegation. Justice Barrett, she seems more willing to just keep this as a textual case. She focused a lot on the fact that IEEPA, like license versus tariff, and again, to me, less interesting. And then Kagan, clearly hostile all around, but leaning in on the non-delegate. Like, I could see Kagan aligning with the conservative justices, striking it down on non-delegation grounds. And I thought, Sotomayor and Justice Jackson, just very hostile all around, happy to strike it down any which way. And I do think that my gut take is that we're not going to actually even see one majority opinion. That there's going to be kind of like a bunch of concurring in opinions. But I would say that it doesn't look good from my perspective for the president's ability to use IEEPA.
Here, I have a question. So, this is before IEEPA came into the fold, right? IEEPA was 1977, and then was it 1971 or 72 that Nixon imposed tariffs broadly, to address like currency manipulation, and I guess it was a balance of payments crisis,
yeah,
right? But like that was an intention to try to induce like other countries to lower their currency, right? Was that sort of the brainchild for what became IEEPA tariffs? And is there,
Correct.
I guess it's not, is there any precedent for what we're doing now, or to be able to say, well, we've done something similar to like this before to affect foreign policy?
Yeah, so there was one case, Yoshida, and so that figured prominently in the discussion. We're getting like some pretty inside baseball, but there was some interesting discussion around it. There was one that back then Congress had a legislative veto, so that would so someone brought up, but we don't have that. Congress doesn't have that anymore. So there was some talk about that, but I think to me it's we make it a very boring opinion. I would say it's just textual, but I think that. I think the ones to watch are those Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, particularly, and possibly joined by Kagan and Sotomayor and Jackson leaning in and saying, you can't. The Congress cannot delegate its tariff power. There was distinction between tariffs and embargoes, and so and that was where that was some of the most interesting discussion I thought, because there was effort to say that in fact, yeah, so the president can embargo shipments because that doesn't, and there's less concern about that because it's not a form of taxation. Whereas, in fact, there did seem to be a consensus in the Supreme Court that we could uphold IEEPA as something to embargo and even to use quota, but not for tariffs. Which, of course, would have a big impact for our members who are much more interested in getting certainty about how much of their market is going to be given away to foreign producers versus how much revenue the government's going to produce.
Yeah, I'll just say, maybe this builds more momentum if this doesn't go the way the president wants, that it builds momentum for the Secure Trade Act or something like that, where we can get a legislative solution of just that 10% universal. Is it 10% universal? Mm-hmm. Removal of most favored nation for China. You get those 35 to 100% tariffs on China.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like you knock out a big issue.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the crux of the revenue. So the main IEEPA orders at play are the IEEPA the one. Sorry, the the legal instruments, the presidential proclamations or executive orders that are at the heart of the case are the president's IEEPA reciprocal order, which is essentially a 10% universal, but then there was also a bunch of supplementary annex rates for a bunch of countries. But look, let's call it the average at like 20. It's not as crazy as it sounds. Like there's very little protection, I should say. We're not stopping a ton of imports with those IEEPA tariffs. So there's the IEEPA reciprocal ones, and then there was the IEEPA fentanyl one, which was a supplementary 20% on China, and just now with a deal last week down to 10%, which they talked about that at the Supreme Court as well. So I can't help but wonder if the timing of the China deal was linked to getting this ahead of the Supreme Court decision. But no, yeah, with that Secure Trade Act, this should be the administration's top congressional priority, because you codify all that revenue, right? I mean, look at in there, the administration says these are regulating tariffs, not revenue tariffs. It's like, okay, well, if you care about, to me, if you care about that revenue, and they do, and they should, and they're right to care about it, top priority, get Congress to pass that act, and then you can, and then in terms of you preserve your revenue, and it's full steam ahead on tariffs for protection vis-a-vis Section 232.
And
Yep.
Chuck, I was also curious for this delegation authority that you're talking about, and how a lot of the justices were a little bit skeptical that, for example, Congress has the legal authority to delegate this power to the executive. Is there any concern, or is there any possible indication that there could be some ripple effects from this that people are considering? So, for example, that would also imply that Congress doesn't have the ability to delegate war power authority or regulatory authority to these executive agencies. And so is there a little bit of a fear that there might be some unintended consequences, or does that not seem to be coming up at all?
Well, there was a lot of the opposite fear. The justices were, the war power came up with that. So there was actually the opposite fear that, gosh, I mean, the concluding remarks even. That the nature of human history is to go to kings and Caesars, right? And republics tend to fall apart. So no, there was the opposite fear that, like, if we just sign off on this, it's the road to Caesardom, right? There was they ended with a quote that was something to the effect of, like, parliaments and republics may prove to be untenable, but they won't, when they die their death, it won't be in court. In this court, because our job is to preserve the Republican congressional form of government. So no, I would say that the overarching concern in Supreme Court was, if we uphold it, what's left of Congress?
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I think that if this does come out like that, using that grounds, it could question a lot of other authority that Congress has delegated. And so that'd be interesting to watch as well. It's a little bit off the trade topic, but yeah, it makes me think of if they're rethinking how this executive branch can wield that power.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, to just take peel back the non-delegation doctrine one more layer. So the way it typically gets, the way sort of another delegation, like so for the other tariff powers. So for Section 301, for Section 232, the word is the intelligible, and I can't believe I'm just blanking on it. Intelligible principle. So did Congress articulate an intelligible principle that kind of narrows the scope of its delegated authority, right? So Congress can't just say wholesale, the power to tax now belongs to the president. That's easy. This is all. You can't do that under the Constitution. But if they would say, okay, well, you're going to have this, very narrow authority, and that's the way, like, with the other, like Section 232 or 122 is a great example, right? Like the judges, they want Section 122. That's the new balance of payments authority that Congress created in response to what Nixon did, and so that says, to address a balance of payments crisis, the president can raise tariffs by up to 15% for 150 days. that's the kind of thing where it's like where that's going to be safe. That would not be struck down under the non-delegation doctrine, because Congress very clearly articulated, like, just, it's not just here's authority to do tariffs. It's here's limited authority to do tariffs under these circumstances, and there's a bunch of safeguards, like you have to check in, and they expire after 6 months, yada yada yada. So that's the kind of thing where the court would be totally comfortable with it. But IEEPA, like the Justice Sotomayor brought up, she's not impressed. She's like, the president is threatening, tariffs for a commercial he doesn't like from the government of Ontario. He's using tariffs against Brazil because he doesn't like, what they're doing in their domestic politics. So she nailed in on all of that. And that's the kind of thing where I don't see the conservative justices bailing the administration out, given how they view about that.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I think this is just going to be so interesting to see what happens, what comes down. I got to believe the administration is prepared for, a backup plan, and they've, that one thing we can say about this administration, they're very persistent about pursuing their goals. So I suspect they'll find a way to kind of keep the momentum going on this issue. But yeah, no, I mean, I guess we'll absolutely be following the updates, obviously, at CPA, and we'll keep you all posted about any kind of decisions that come down. Certainly likely to cover it again on the big three. But I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap up the program for this week. Thanks, Chuck, for taking the time to meet with us.
Thanks for having me here.
Talk to the folks, yeah. And so until next week, I'm going to sign off on behalf of Andrew and Chuck. We'll see you next week. Take care. Thank you.
So, bye.